Welcome. This is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery for the Radical Recovery Summit series. And I have three really interesting guests here today. Dan McClintock, his mother, Dana McClintock, and Scott Kiloby. And so I'd like for each of you to just introduce yourself. Just tell us who you are, what you want people to know as we start, and then we'll get more into that as we go through. So do you want to start, Dana?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dana. And think that really it's important for me to tell my part of the story that we're going to talk about today because it's such a family. These issues that happen in families get passed on from generation to generation. And we've experienced in our family a lot of healing sort of retroactively and going forward. So I feel like it's important to share my part of that, and I'm happy to be here and do that with you all.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to hearing this. Yeah, it's going to be great. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, hey, I'm Dan, and I am a facilitator at the center now, but I also was a client about 2 years ago, and I was a client here for 90 days. So I have experience on both sides of all of this. So I'll be sharing both things. So.
Oh, thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
And Scott.
Yeah, so I'm Scott Kiloby, one of the owners of the Kiloby Center for Recovery and the Natural Rest House, which is our detox facility. The Kiloby Center is our IOP. Yeah, Dan's been a client. Dan and Dana are both friends. And so we're doing kind of a unique thing today for those who are listening is we're going to talk about the model at the center that we're using and how it's changed so much. And then we're going to go and just listen to Dan. And for those of you wondering what they're here for, to listen to them tell their story, mother and son story, that's connected to what we're talking about today in terms of maybe changing the way that we relate to each other around this topic of in families of addiction and trauma and things like that. So, and there's other things I could say about myself, but I mean, people have watched this before, they know who we are, and I'm much more interested in getting into the conversation.
I just finished a 12-week session class on intergenerational trauma and resilience. And, one of the things that people said over and over and over, and this last class was mostly just, we went around, there was about 20 people that were online live, and then just kind of talking about what was most important to us about the class. And over and over and over, people said the chance to be really authentic and to have our stories heard and not be judged for that. And be a safe space. And that's exactly what we're doing here.
That's awesome.
There is the old and the new model of recovery. And I know since you've opened the Kiloby Center, you're a real innovator. And you really are looking for things that work and that really help and that bring people way past abstinence into actual recovery. Hence the name of this series, the Radical Recovery Summit as well. So can you talk about the new model and the old model and how that works for you at the center?
Yeah, first, one way that we innovated is that we're bringing non-dual awareness and self-inquiry and mindfulness as the primary way that we help people sort of really untangle the belief, the traumas and the beliefs and the shame and what we call deficiency stories under their addictions, but just the things that drive their suffering generally. So we're bringing a different approach, or a very old approach, right? Thousands of years old, to something new, something fresh, in a fresh space in the addiction space. So that's an innovation. But here's what we're interested in talking about today is that as we've done that, because with this particular type of inquiry, as you know, that we do, it opens up facets of our consciousness that were previously hidden to us, like the unconscious starts to become more online, and we start to see some of the things that are really driving our behavior, things that were hidden to us. And that's just one of the great things about this modality. It's just, you could get there with another modality and you may not. I don't know. It depends. But with this one, we know that we can go to some of these places. And there's a lot of insight that comes out of these places. So as we developed the Kiloby Center, I think, and then after Dan came, really, the original intent of the Kiloby Center was to have a place of unconditional love and support and really just a place for inquiry. And of course, we came into this space, which is the addiction treatment space, and there's regulation here. So the state oversees us, and then our accreditation agency. And pretty soon, we started to feel like we were being pulled in the direction of what I would call the old model, which is, in this industry, there's a lot of diversity in terms of programs. So I don't want to lump all programs together, but there's certainly a large segment of the programs that are very much doing a lot of what they've been doing for years, sort of not innovating. And of course, you're talking to people in the Radical Recovery Summit that are innovating,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there's a lot of stagnancy in this space. And so that old model has a few things with it. One thing about it I feel like is it double speaks around addiction. It says that the substance or the activity shouldn't be focused on, it's just a symptom, but then it goes and then focuses on that quite often. So then it's sending a signal to people that what's important is what you're using instead of what happened to you, right? What happened in your life? And that's a different question. What happened to you starts to answer the question of what are your traumas? What are the self-esteem, the deficiency stories that you're carrying around? What is all the stuff that you brought that gets, combined into the addictive behavior? Just thinking of it differently in terms of what happened to you, is the focus stops being about what are you using to medicate that. That's just your medicine. That just happens to be your medicine. It may not be the best way to medicate an issue. Like if you've got trauma or something, it may not be best to sort of just overindulge all the time in sugar or heroin, obviously. But it's the best that you have until you get healed, right? And the healing has to offer something more than the drug or the sugar, or it will end up, losing the battle in the end. So what we're trying to do is to go into those deep places to really set people free, like to set people free in those areas of their unconscious that are driving their suffering, really. And as their suffering starts to quiet down, just their overall suffering, their sense of just being comfortable in their own skin, their central nervous system more regulated, their sense of who they are much clearer. They're just more awake. There's an awakening that happens, as where they actually recognize an awareness. And that's one thing that's great about us, an awareness that's not of the ego, really, that's aware of the ego, but it's not of the ego. So these are all very important things that happen through this model. But the big thing is we're not focusing on behavior. We're focusing on these drivers. So I don't know if that answers your question. We know like there's 3 or 4 big categories, and then we know that there's other things that get added into that. But one of them is just traumas. I don't want to say just traumas. It's a huge category. So there's traumas, which we define so broadly. It could be like classic or extreme trauma that you hear about in the textbooks, like combat trauma or molestation or something. But we define it as any pivotal event that was emotionally too overwhelming, and you didn't process it, and so you're carrying it around, and you're getting re-triggered around that kind of event or person. So that's a very broad definition. A lot of different stuff falls in that. Even things like, intergenerational stuff, but also just being with a father or a mother who related to you a certain way. Maybe didn't hit you, but related to you in a certain way that didn't make you feel safe or loved or whatever. So, and connected to that, as you know, one of the drivers for us are the deficiency stories. That's our language, just meaning everybody carries around one or more really core belief systems about who they are, as if something is fundamentally missing from who they are. So it's like they're inadequate, they're not good enough, they're unsafe, they're unsupported, they feel either something or in something, and that's the deficiency, that feeling of lack that we carry around. And as we say, we carry it around because we're identified with ego and the mind. And that ego is really a story of lack, a story of deficiency. It's never enough to the mind-based story. Whatever it is in life, you never get enough love. You never get enough drugs. You never get enough food. You never get enough of any attention to satisfy a story that is inherently deficient by nature. because it's a false story. So that's driving the addiction, because that creates uncomfortable feelings like pain, core woundedness, like that deep feeling of there's something wrong with me at the core. So
those feelings of the experiences we have of feeling that way turn into beliefs.
Yeah.
Right.
You can track it. You can see how people feel these feelings around this stuff, this core woundedness, and then how they then want to use. And if they'll tell you, sometimes they won't tell you. So deficiency stories, trauma, shame is another big one, right? So if we have enough time with people, we like to go back to all the shameful events, not just connected with addiction, addictive behavior, but anything that it's like whatever you don't want to be exposed to others, you don't have to expose to others, but in inquiry, you can expose yourself to others, to bring those feelings up so that you can be okay with them, finally meet them, instead of bearing, because shame avoidance is a huge thing. We just do it every day. And so all you can do with any work is just meet that more, bring it up into your awareness, let it dissolve into the awareness and leave you, instead of carrying it around, So shame, traumas, deficiency stories. And then I think the big one that we're talking about today, although today we'll touch on all of them, is external pressure, which is just what we all do to each other. It's not just that some of us do it to, we'll hear the story of what I think is a poignant story today from Dana, mom, talking about her trying to help her parents, and then trying to help Dan, who's here, her son. And that's one way that external pressure shows up, but it shows up in all of our relationships. So external pressure is that feeling that there are people outside of you who first of all help to create the addiction, in the sense that if they're parents or people that you look up to, if you didn't feel like you got the love or the safety or the attention or something from them, even if they did a good job, if the perception to the child is that they didn't get that, then there's a feeling of that feeling of deficiency gets either created or strengthened in the moment that it feels like you didn't get that from mom and dad. So family dynamics, as you know, plays into the creation of our addictive behaviors, because as we feel fundamentally deficient, like from parents or from kids at school, all of that, we want to fill that hole up, that pain, with drugs, alcohol, food. So there's one way the external pressure happens early, in the sense that all the expectations that are placed on us in our society, even things like the expectation to get good grades, although it's a wonderful expectation in the minds of many parents, it's also received differently from kids sometimes.
Right.
It's received that there's nothing that I can do that will ever make you. And that's a very, very hurtful feeling. Just something as innocent as that. And then if you think other things that more unconscious parents do, rather than not just you're not meeting the grades, but a number of messages that are sent, either consciously or unconsciously, that give the child the message that there's something wrong with them. So that's the first wave. And then the second wave is then the child then might develop an addiction because of a propensity for that genetically, or because of these traumas and these deficiency stories and the family dynamics. These things come together to help create the addictive behavior. And then what happens when the addictive behavior gets there is often the same external pressure comes in. You try to fix that, not knowing that it helped create it by doing this pressure. And then at the time, and that itself, this pressure is always a feeling of being traumatized on some level. Because from outside, you're hearing there's something wrong with you. And now there's something really wrong with you because you're addicted, because you tried to use something to cope with the pain that this was giving you earlier in your life. See that? It's a really, really thing. You've got to feel it and feel what's going on in these relationships with our lovers and our partners and our sons and our daughters. What we're doing to them, what we think is coming from love, is often coming from fear and our own deficiency stories, as we pressure them to get well and to get better, so we will feel okay.
Yeah. Well, what
Right?
really strikes me though is how these are not separate categories. Like the trauma, the deficiency, all of these are like a big cycle that reinforces itself. And it might be something really fundamental, like a young child that's growing up knowing that they're different in their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And that's not acceptable, or there's that feeling there's something really basically wrong with this, the shame we feel, the drive to escape from that feeling.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
most people can definitely relate to that. And
Mhm.
so to bring us to external pressures, that as we got to Kiloby Center, and as you know, we have this model where what we're doing is we're examining all of these beliefs and feelings,
Right.
really raw and vulnerable somatic work. And what comes up is just all of the trauma of the external pressure that one has experienced in their life, getting to the place where they're at the Kiloby Center. So meaning that our first wave of it was just watching interventions being done moments before they were entering treatment, people. And so as they were getting there, we were spending an inordinate amount of time dealing with the trauma of the intervention. Because of the way that it was delivered from the external pressuring thing. So what happens then is the person, what we notice, another wave of this, or another element of this, is not only did we have to deal with the trauma of all the external pressure and the intervention, which was all of this pressure was creating a desire to use more and to be deceptive about it. So why is it creating a desire to use more? It's the simple fact of, like, if you tell me that I shouldn't do something, it just makes me want to do it more. That's that simple principle placed into action in a very dynamic situation, which is a family with all of that history and emotions. So the pressure that a family can place on a family members can be felt so much stronger than almost any pressure. And so the point being is, what happens is as the person internalizes that pressure, and then it sort of becomes part of the deficiency story, and it can feel like trauma. You can feel that way because of the judgment and the shame, and what it does is it drives the person into dishonesty. So the way that I deal with you, if you're my external pressure, is that I don't tell you anything that I think that you're going to react in a way that's going to be like this. So that we have a dynamic that's almost impossible to cure, because on one hand we have the person who's using this substance or behavior as a way to medicate trauma and whatever else that was caused by external pressure. And then the external pressure is trying to come in to fix that situation. But the person who's addicted feels that pressure, and their natural response often is to go underground and to lie and to hide, in which case there can be no communication. There's a breakdown there. This one's trying to fix, and this one wants to hide or fight or flee.
Yeah.
So something new has to happen in that. Right.
And the thing is that we're afraid to be honest and authentic because we feel like we're being judged. We feel that pressure. We feel so much shame. We want to avoid the shame of that. So what are you doing to inject this new thing into here that's going to make that possible?
Well, it's a work in progress, but the first thing is the inquiry process.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't know it, but it's a mindfulness or non-dual awareness based process where you literally untangle, almost like in a surgical way. You untangle the thoughts and feelings that are held together around these stories of these deficiency stories and the stories of the external pressure, how they manifest as stories and beliefs in our life. You untangle those things from believing that they're real and true to seeing that they're just things that we believe. It's like programming. It's like we grew up in a cult. We don't realize it. A lot like that. And then at some point we realize it, and then we recognize we have to go to do some deprogramming to get out of that. Because under that, there is love. It's like when we pull back the conditions of our love, and we see that in inquiry a lot. It's like we're looking at ways in which we've put a sense of separation between ourselves and other people, either through judgment or conditions or whatever it is. And as we pull those things back and those beliefs back, pull them back, meaning let them dissolve in awareness, let them dissolve. what shows up is just the love that we do feel for the person and for each other. And that's the thing that's dry. It's like under all of the other stuff, the storm of stuff, there is this love and this love is clear. This love, this presence that you experience when there is that kind of awakening, like a real awakening, is very, very powerful and very, very clear and wise. And you can trust it because it's not tied into deficiency stories. It's not driven by emotion. It's not driven by fear or attachment to outcomes. You see, so it naturally just wants to love, but not in a way that is as sticky or anything like that. So therefore, you already have it. If you do the inquiry work, you're already set in motion this awakening, the real awakening that can happen in this area. And the other thing is just context, just talking about this and saying to our staff, to our clients, to everybody out there, the answer is unconditional love, but how do you get there? So what we do is we use the inquiry to get there, and then the unconditional love is just, there are things that we say to people that we feel like come from the language of unconditional love, where they're truly given a choice and a freedom about things, and that we're not doing this to them anymore, that we're trying to be the people that don't do that anymore. And so that just changing the way you relate to people, right, just has a transformative effect. When you switch, when you shift on your side, they can then have room to change. It's simple as that. But the combination is this context around unconditional love. And what does unconditional love really look like? Not the unconditional love that we get sold, which is often conditional love.
Right.
What does it really look like? And then how do you get there? Which is, we think, through this inquiry process. Jonathan Hari's answer, I don't know his full message. I agree with that part of his message, but most things are partial to me. Mm-hmm. It's like, how do I love unconditionally? Because the ego is a set of conditions, as you know. Right. My ego meaning is just that thought-based self that comes up in words and pictures in our awareness every day, tells us that it gives us reasons why we can't truly love people the way that they actually are. Right. It just gives us those reasons constantly. And so as in inquiry, as you dissolve those reasons, because you see the reasons are based in fear. So you actually dissolve the fear that's driving the thoughts, right? The fear or the woundedness or something. As that stuff dissolves, those are the conditions right there. As those dissolve, there's just a natural love, a very simple love that shows up. And that's, to me, the answer. For me, it's not just unconditional love, because I don't know how to do that unless I do work on the belief systems within myself that are keeping it from happening.
So one of the ways we could look on that is that we dissolve the impediments to getting to know ourselves. We aren't any longer trying to use other people to reassure ourselves or to validate that we're human beings that have some value. And then that is part of what opens up that space to just really meet people as we are.
Yeah, and it's internal and external, or you could say it's like the work has to be within. And for us, it's the interior awareness where all of these beliefs show up as thoughts, feelings, and sensations. So we work with that directly, the woundedness and all that. Yeah. But it's the external too, because as you start to be around people who love you, like who really love you, you see what I mean? And you feel
that's your experience, your felt experience.
Yeah. It's not a love with a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And it's not a love, that's about to explode in anger if you get to a certain place. It's a love, you know that you're loved. It's the whole thing of, like, Anthony DeMello, I just read it in a book that Dan said. He said, when a child feels totally loved by his parents, the child is then free to explore the world and go pick up frogs and everything. Mm-hmm. But if the child doesn't experience that, once the child, but real love when you feel it, seems like unconditional love is felt. It's so powerful that it frees you from being attached.
Right.
Because you know it. And there's all the attachment that goes on in our codependency and stuff is so relevant to what I'm talking about. It's just a different kind of love.
Well, and I thought it was very interesting that in the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, that emotional neglect is one of the key experiences. It's very hard for kids. And that we have that survival level need to be included and seen and accepted for who we are. And if we don't have that, then we feel threatened, and then we're hustling for connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, some basic things that we seem to need in order to function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just want to tell people why we brought them here to set the frame for this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dan, just real quick, he'll tell you the story of being on the receiving end of the external pressure and the trauma. And Dana will tell you the story of how she's worked with parents in her family that were struggling with addiction, and then with Dan. And so there's these two different perspectives on this coming in this interview. You've got a mother who was trying very desperately to fix an issue she saw in her family, and then a son responding to that mother's call, and then the stuff that ensued after that. But what I want you to really focus on as you hear them is just the, not to put pressure on them, is that you can feel in the tone of their energy and how they tell the story that they've healed a lot of this. They've healed tons of it. And so that's the point I want you to hear, is listen with your heart, like to that part of it as they tell it.
All right. Dan, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Just to add to what Scott was talking about at the center, about how we're sort of implementing this new model with clients that come here. The bottom line really is, it's like we got to not mind what the clients are doing. You know, at the end of the day, it's sort of like, there's a principle of, if I, you know, the number one way to keep the alcoholic or the addict drinking or using is to want them to change, is to want them to be different somehow, you know? And so that's what we, as staff at the center, are doing this work with ourselves, because if we're not, when we're wanting people to change or be different, we're shooting on them or punishing them or whatever, they're not going to heal. It's not going to happen. You know, they're just
And
going to
people can really sense that. It has to be very genuine on our part to not have any anxiety or compulsion around that.
Yeah, exactly. And when you, like you said, when you feel somebody that's coming at you with just love, with just that, it's almost like a child. You know what I mean? Like you feel like that, the childlike sort of just unconditional love. It's like, well, I'll just tell you everything, you know? So, and I've been on both sides of it, and it's amazing, both on both sides. So, okay. So I guess I just start at the beginning. So I was raised in a family that it wasn't fundamental religion. We were Presbyterian, so it was kind of just like middle of the road, you know. But that was always there, sort of the religious thing hanging over. And so, and I've dealt with sexual addiction, with porn addiction, and all this stuff. So, and relationship addiction, and so starting with that, with the religious kind of overtones, there's already shame about anything sexual. There's already shame, and there's already hiding going on. So just noticing that energy as a real young kid, sort of just like, okay, this is not okay. So it just sets the tone, sort of. So what happened was, when I was, I guess, 10 or 11 or something, I had a friend that was a year or two younger than me, and we experimented. I experimented with other kids, which I come to find out later is totally normal. Like that's what kids do when they're starting to. And so, but you know, since there was this shame thing, I was like, oh, what I'm doing, maybe this is bad. A little bit of that going on, but so I experimented with this friend of mine and kind of just forgot about it. I just thought, okay, let's not go there, not think about it anymore. And then jump ahead 10 years, I'm in my first year of college. This is 2000. And my parents get a letter in the mail from this kid's parents that says, you know, Dan basically sexually abused our son, it came out in therapy that there was like something happened to him, and he was, this is the reason that he's had depression, anxiety, and had all these problems and stuff. And so mom and dad got this letter and called me downstairs and told me. And I remember mom just being I've never seen her like that before. She was just panicked, and eyes were just, oof, like, what is this? What have you done? And, do you remember this? And I, at the time, was like, vaguely, but it seems like, and it's like, well, you're lying. You did more than all this. And so for me, it was just shut down. I just kind of like shut down. And so
Right.
That's an example of external pressure.
Oh, that's a terrible experience to go through.
Yeah.
Very traumatic, yeah.
And so I was 20, and I was still in college, and I was dependent on them financially. So they said, here's what you're doing. You're going to go to this sex therapist. You're going to start going to 12-step for sexual addiction. You're going to do this and a list of things. And I just kind of submitted, right? And I was like, okay, yeah, you're right. I mean, I have to, because you're supporting me, and I got to do this. And meanwhile, there's this other part of me over here that's like going, what? I don't know if I did anything, and this feels wrong. This kind of pressure feels wrong, but I didn't share that. It was more like, okay, I'll just go along with what you're saying. So, and I remember thinking, God, I must have done something really bad, and started to manufacture a story about how I did, and how I, was, and so, and really believed it. I thought, well, and then started to really take on that identity of, okay, I'm this bad sex addict, pervert. Even when I remember even as far as going like, I'm a child molester. I'm like, I'm 10 and the kid's 8 or 9, and so it's like, but in my head I was like, no, that's what I am. So anyways, I started to take on this addict identity and all the beliefs around the addict identity in order to partially to please mom and dad, And I started martyring myself kind of unconsciously. I started getting rid of everything in my life that I enjoyed or that I thought was good. I broke up with the girl that I was in love with. I quit the bands that was just becoming successful, and just was like, well, now life is suffering now. I have time to, pay the piper or whatever. So, and ironically, like this is the timing of it was wild, because this was 2001 is right when high-speed internet started to happen.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it was like, I'm an addict. I'm addicted to this stuff. Meanwhile, we're just real quick prior to that, it was pretty normal sexually. There was some, shame and stuff, but I was dating people and, regular masturbation, and it wasn't out of control. It was just kind of a normal thing that happened, And so I take on the addict identity. I start to shut down. High-speed internet comes into existence, and the addiction just explodes.
Right.
It ramps up, and I start, using or acting out even more,
Mm-hmm.
And mainly it was with porn, because getting into the 12-step program, it was like, don't look at people, don't, have a rubber band on your wrist where if you look at someone and you feel attracted to them, snap it, to remind yourself that that's bad or that's wrong.
Well, the aversion therapy.
Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, it was. In the side note, the program that I got into was a pretty religious. It was more religious than some of the other sexual addiction stuff. So it was very like rigid and
Shame-based.
Shame-based, yeah.
Yeah.
And no one in there was sober. Everybody in there was suffering and looking at their feet and feeling ashamed all the time. So it was pretty miserable.
Right.
And I'm 20 and I'm in there with all these guys. They're like in their 40s and 50s. It's this kid,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like, well, I deserve this. So, so looking back on it now, I start to see that the external pressure that got put on me, I internalized it, and it became part of the belief system internally that I had that was, And so I didn't need someone else doing it now because I was doing it to me.
And I can see that's how it would work. You get that kind of pressure, you form those beliefs, you feel all that shame, and you internalize it. That would happen to anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember it was like, I mean, almost like to the experience of when they confronted me with that letter, it was like life was kind of like this. It felt like this. And as soon as that happened, it was like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember feeling that physically and kind of emotionally. It just like shut. It was like tunnel vision, like narrowed.
Right.
You know? So, so that went on for the next 13 years.
Wow. That's a long
Right?
time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like I stayed with it and did a bunch of stuff to try to make up for it. Like I got into like what would you say it was, like a religious, like evangelical, like trying to get people to come to
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
to that religion, and
Mm-hmm.
Which in large part was to try to atone, and make up for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it never, I mean, the addictive stuff, it never like stopped. It kind of got worse and worse, honestly. There was repression happening too, obviously. Like,
Oh, okay.
not only did I not, it was like, hey, don't ever use porn. It was like, don't ever have sex. Don't ever masturbate. Don't ever do anything sexual. Just nothing. Like repress. Which of course would make every, I don't know, month or so, it just this big explosion of that energy that sexual energy and that stuff has to come out somehow, so I would binge on porn, or I would, do whatever. So, yeah, so that went on for 13 years. So when I was 33, kind of lost the 20s in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's good stuff. It wasn't all just horrific, but it was like, that was,
That was the overall tone. It was very much affected by that. Those beliefs and the shame.
Hanging over everything,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in 33, and I got into, somebody gave me, ironically, I was in Al-Anon during this time too, but Mom gave me a copy of Byron Katie's Loving What Is. Which, coming from her, I was like, what? Like, which, because she had gotten into that stuff too. I mean, that was great though. I appreciate it. But so that linked me into Scott's work, because I was searching for inquiry, and I'd been in 12-step and all this stuff, but searching for inquiry and addiction, and I came up with Scott's name, and ended up coming out, watching some of Scott's videos, really resonating with what he was talking about, obviously with Katie as well, Eckhart Tolle, came out to the center and stayed for 90 days and just like started undoing a lot of the beliefs and a lot of the somatic and emotional stuff that was attached to the beliefs. And it was like, oh my God. And started kind of figuring out what had been happening for the last 13 years, because it got really confusing. It's like when you live in the world of like thinking and belief and concepts like this, it gets confusing. It's like, what is going on? What's happening here? So, yeah. And so at the center, Scott and some of the other facilitators were doing the new model, and Scott would say things like, okay, go masturbate or go watch porn, which for me, with all these beliefs, I was like, no, I can't do that. I'm not allowed, but he'd say, do it. And let's see what happens. So I trusted, because I could tell that he obviously wasn't pressuring me, saying, go do it, And so it was that unconditional love, and I would do it, and the fallout from it would bring up all of this trauma that I'd sort of like put under this net, all the stuff that I hadn't looked at, all the repression, a lot of the shame, a lot of the external pressure, pulling that stuff up, clearing it, doing inquiry. And it was just kind of incredible. And the funny thing that happened was the more I did that work, and that I still do the work, the less it matters if I do anything sexual, the less I mind, right? And then the less that I act out.
Right. So when you do have some kind of sexual activity, you're not shaming yourself for it anymore.
No, and if something does come up, I have a way to look. I have tools to look at it, but it's the trajectory of it just coming down, down, down. And I also had an experience of, when I was in this stuff, of not allowing myself to be attracted to anybody and not connecting and shutting down and not being intimate or open.
Right.
And so same thing happens as it comes down, all the trauma and shame and deficiency stories around this stuff. I start really having feelings and wanting to connect with people, and I have a real strong love and crush on this one person right now too. So it's like I hadn't had that in 13 years,
Right. You're coming alive.
Yeah, coming back to life a little bit, a lot.
Well, thank you for sharing that and being so honest about that, and to not be shaming yourself as you were doing it. I could feel that it was difficult at the time, and that you don't really believe any of that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're really free from it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just listening to Dan's story again, and I know you two have connected in a very honest and authentic way over the years about this. What would you like to share from your perspective?
Well, it's always, as much as we have addressed this, that I've addressed it and heard Dan talk about it, it's still difficult to hear. We just had an experience there was a retreat, awakening and embodiment retreat that we were both a part of, that Scott led recently, and we told the story to the group of other participants. And and I got to listen to Dan first, just like I just did, and it still just brings up so many feelings for me. And I'd like to say, just leading out from it, just that I recognize, because I didn't say this at the beginning, but I also have been a client at the Kiloby Center. Last winter was there for 3 months and did a lot of work around my own beliefs, my own upbringing, around sexuality, around shame, around what happened in my family. And I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit, just so you can see sort of how it trickled down into how I related to Dan as he was growing up. But it was a very profound experience for me at the center. And I began to kind of understand how the pressure that I felt growing up and that I then put on Dan had affected me, our family, that external pressure that Scott and Dan just talked about. And I also, it was like right at the end of when Dan was sharing about his crush on the woman that he's involved with now. It's just this beautiful sort of sense of, I was taken back to a scene in, well, it was actually a line from the movie, I think it was the original movie, Jurassic Park, where one of the guys said, life breaks out. And that's what it feels like to me. It's like what I learned to do in my family was sort of squelch the life force.
Yes.
So then I did that going forward in my parenting with Dan. And it's like life breaks out, thank God, life breaks out. And I think life breaks out if you do the work, if you're willing to go there and look at, all these beliefs and things that caused you the fear that caused you to put external pressure on other people. So my family growing up, my parents were alcoholics, both of them. And I learned that basically that I had to the way that I tried to stay connected to them was to try to fix them. To try to, I guess I would say my addiction has been to try to fix and manage and control. That's how my conditioning kind of happened in that setting. And I'll come back to this later. But also, my mother, I believe, this is not anything she ever told me, but I believe she was sexually abused by her dad. So I grew up with a mother who had a whole bunch of repression and pain and sort of the trauma of abuse around sexual issues. And then she married my dad, who acted out and was unfaithful to her. And so that just, I think, reinforced a lot of her beliefs about herself, and that sex was damaging, and that it was hurtful, and that it was dangerous. And so I grew up with this, and nobody ever really talked about it. It was just that's, I began to see, that's the environment that I lived in. Fast forward to my being a parent. And so raising a child who, just did a lot of the, as Dan said, did a lot of the normal things that kids do, exploring, just the energy and the curiosity around sex. But to me, it was like, oh my God, it's like all of that stuff about it being dangerous and damaging and hurtful and painful came up. And so it sort of triggered me into I need to fix this. I need to manage this. I need to control this. And it wasn't anything I was conscious of at the time. I mean, I was so unconscious of all of that,
Right.
even though I was in therapy. But it was not the kind of therapy, it was not the kind of somatic work, the kind of awareness and mindfulness work that we do at the center, at the Kiloby Center. Which, having experienced both, I can tell you which one makes the difference. And that would come up in numerous different ways. But I think when we got this letter from the friend of ours, and these were people that I had known for years and years, the parents of the kid. And I just completely, I was hysterical. I mean, I couldn't even breathe. I was hyperventilating when I was reading that letter. And I thought, oh my God, it's like all of the feelings from my family growing up just came rushing to the surface. And it was what I had been trying to avoid for years, for most of my life, not wanting to feel that. And I think that a lot of the pressure that I put on Dan, a lot of that external pressure, was to try to fix him so that I wouldn't have to feel my own distress.
Right. Of course, that must have been very shocking, and I can see why you would go into that kind of a response to a letter like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And later, much later, I realized how very selfish it was of me, how much self-interest I had in that. Like, you need to change so that I don't have to feel my feelings.
Right.
You need to change so that I don't have to feel all that painful stuff that I grew up with that I didn't know what the hell to do with.
Right. And there's also the shame a parent feels around their child's behavior too.
Yeah.
That must have been part of it.
Yeah. I think so, but I think it was more that thing about my wanting him to be different so that I wouldn't have to feel
You wouldn't have to feel, right.
all that stuff that was there that I had repressed for so long. And that I tried to manage and control by trying to manage and control Dan or my husband or whoever happened to be, my parents when I was growing up. Back to my family of origin for a minute. I'm going to say, I was trying to think of how old Dan was then, but I was in my late 30s, so Dan must have been around 10. I might have been about 40. My brother and sister and I was the oldest of 3 children. And by the way, I ended up feeling like I had to take care of not just my parents, but also my younger brother and sister when I was growing up. So my brother and sister and I decided that we needed to do a professional intervention with our parents because they kind of went in and out of drinking over the years, but it was starting to get bad again around that time. And so we contacted an interventionist, a professional person, and she was very, helpful and kind of gave us the whole picture of what was likely to happen. And even though she said only about 20% of these ever work, we decided to take the risk and do it anyway. And if I could rewind and do it differently, I would not do it again. And the reason I say that is because of that whole, what I'm coming to understand about the whole external pressure thing. Because what we did by doing that was, here were 2 people who were had so much pain in their lives and so much shame, both of them, around their sexuality, but also just around how they were raising their children, around not being emotionally available, around their drinking, all of that. That what we did was we just zoomed in on that and said, yes, there's something wrong with you and you need to fix it because we don't want to put up with this anymore. And it was so, when I realized that when I was at the Kiloby Center, because all the way up until that time, this last year, I thought, well, what I had done was really the right thing. It was the caring thing to do. And everybody I knew thought that. Everybody said, oh, you guys were so courageous. And and when I started doing the work around looking at my own beliefs and my own upbringing, and the way that it had played out in my life, I realized, oh my God, it was so hurtful to them. Just the way that what I did with Dan was hurtful to him. It was all, as I said, it was all unconscious. What happened with my parents after we did the intervention was kind of going back to what Scott said about when you come with shame, when you come with that external pressure on somebody, that it really increases the chances that they'll use, or that, they'll relapse, or that, that's what happened with my parents, basically. They went into treatment for about 10 days. They came out. They really started using after that, and the whole family just started. I mean, I'm not saying that it wasn't fractured before that, but all the fracturing just rose to the surface. Things got much worse. And looking back on it now, I can see that's part of why that happened, because we were coming with that external pressure and the shame. And people think, oh, well, that's going to help. If I let them know that I'm hurt because of what they did, or that they need to change, that's going to help. Well, guess what? That's what this whole thing has been about today, really. The old model versus the new model. And as I told the people on the retreat when I was talking about my relationship with Dan, and even just listening to him now, I mean, I love Dan with all my heart. And I would not have ever done anything intentionally to hurt him. But I wasn't aware. I wasn't conscious. I didn't have the skills. I had no idea what was going on with me. I had no idea that I was transmitting something that had been going on probably for generations in our family, but at least for sure in my family of origin. And then just taking that and bringing that, into my relationship with our son. So, as I said, I wish I could do a rewind with Dan, and I wish I could do a rewind with my parents. And yet, one of the reasons that I'm here and that I did the work at the Kiloby Center, and I'm having this conversation with you all, is because I saw Dan's transformation. And it was like that whole thing Scott was talking about, when you experience, and Dan addressed it too, when you experience unconditional love. And I could see it. All of a sudden, I could see more who he really was. Not who I wanted him to be, but who he really was. And he's always been such a sensitive. I mean, he came out of the womb, he was sensitive, and that's such a beautiful thing about him. But I could just see all of that sort of coming to the surface, not the hiding and the pretending and the, having to submit that he talked about, but really more sort of allowing, his true nature to show up. And so seeing that, I thought, ooh, that's beautiful. Let me check this out. Let me check this out for myself, because I've been searching a lot of my life for, really, who am I? And instead of trying to get that affirmation from other people, get the validation from other people, which is what I've done most of my life, to really begin to look at, well, what are all these deficiency stories I've been carrying, these beliefs that I've had that get in the way of my really experiencing who I really am, and who, in essence, who I am. And because I saw that in Dan, it sort of it showed me some potential for me. So that's where doing this work as a family has been powerful and profound in so many ways. recently, and I'm just very grateful to have had the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about what it sounds like you came to life as well through this work? Can you say a little bit about what that's like for you now? What's changed?
It's like I guess the best way to say it is I'm more aware. It's like when I am in a dialogue, in an interaction with somebody, and some of my old beliefs start to show up, like I don't matter, I'm not important. I see it and I go, oh, there that story is. It's like I'm not so identified with it. I can step back from it now and see.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see when I start to put external pressure. I can see when other people are doing it to me now more.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, I'm not going to go with that program. And I can see when I'm starting to do it. Say, for instance, with my husband, I can see when I'm starting to do it. And when I go ahead and do it, I can say, oh, wait, that was really unkind of me. I'm sorry. I just overstepped the line there. And that was wrong of me to do that. So it's like it's like what you were talking about earlier, Lynn, like really being able to show up more authentically. That's what it feels like. It feels like just being true to who I am, being able to be more authentic, to speak up when I need to own what I need to own, to take responsibility for myself, because my almost just automatic, conditioned, habitual pattern was when something went wrong to go, your fault.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what I experienced growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's my parents had such a terrible time. They didn't have a way to take responsibility. So they'd say to us, it's your fault.
Right.
So they're trying to get us to change. We're trying to get them to change. I'm trying to get Dan to change. I'm trying to get Dave to change. It feels like all that is just disintegrating. Feels very freeing.
And it seems like there's a lot of acceptance for whatever it is that's coming and going. You're not getting sucked into it, but you're not shaming yourself for the fact that it still comes up at times.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a way to just be present with that.
A way to notice it and to look at it, as Dan said, a way to inquire into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I have tools now that I didn't have before. I heard Scott say something on their treat. He says, there's no rules, there's just tools. That's so great. I mean, it was a great way to remember. It sounds sort of 12-steppish, almost like an acronym, but it was really helpful. I thought, that's really true.
There's a lot of space there for people to be who they are.
Yeah. It's a great way to say it.
Yeah. It's such a deep transformation. The journey of I can see where you had that impulse as a child to fix your parents. And part of that was they were saying it was your fault. And so of course you go, oh my goodness, I don't want that. So I better get in there and fix it.
Yeah.
And then how that natural avoidance of all of that ickiness and the shutdown and we can't be present with it until we find a way to be safely present with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really see it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just feeling the pain of all that for all those families. And knowing finally that this story gets to be heard, because they say it so articulately. There's no, I was saying to Dan, I was texting Dan as they were talking, because, here I am, what a teacher or whatever you want to call me. There's no way that I could put in a book or in a lecture what just got articulated if you really hear what got articulated there. The reason I think I was so affected by that, I've heard this story before, and I facilitated Dan on all of these issues. I mean, I've been his facilitator really for a year and a half. So I know intimately the details. I don't know them in the way I didn't live through them, but I know the details of it. And they're both very dear to me. But it's the fact of knowing that that people will hear it. That this kind of story, I don't know if it's out there anywhere. I don't know. Maybe it is. That this kind of story finally gets to get heard, and and then maybe by hearing it, something will change around all of this. I've experienced it in my own family, so I was checking in to see if I was feeling something around that, but I've done a lot of inquiry with that. It was more just the touching into just knowing that people are going to hear the message if they can really hear it from their heart, that's all.
Mm. One of the things that was coming up for me was how much shame there is around failing our children, and how hard it is, and the work I've done around letting my son down, and how unconscious all of that was.
Yeah.
And I love him, and I would never have done that deliberately. And I would love to be able to roll that back, which of course we can't do. And in the present, we're really connected on a deep level. And that's wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
And that's all we all want. That's all we all want, right?
Yeah.
There's a couple of things I just wanted to, go over that Dan said that I thought were really great. He hit so many of the points. He said something around, being labeled the addict, and then the internet was born right at that time. And then he said it ramped up. The addictive behavior ramped up. And I think it's important to talk about maybe why it ramped up, because we don't really know exactly why, right? Because that wasn't going on before. He was saying there was sexual activity. Shame is an aphrodisiac when it comes to porn addiction. That's a hard pill for some people to swallow, because what we do is we like to shame the people with the idea that shaming them will be the answer to the problem. But from someone who's dealing with porn and sex addiction, which is already a shame-based activity because it's in the dark and it's hidden, when they receive shame from external, it ends up driving that behavior, that very sort of closeted, hiding sexual porn behavior. So it's quite a mess, when you're talking about how we relate. But when it comes to drugs and alcohol, it's very similar. This is not just for porn and sex. It's that the same kind of thing. You can't call it an aphrodisiac, but shame is a driver for addiction. So this kind of conversation where everybody just puts everything on the table absolutely is an antidote to shame, right? Because it just says, here's exactly who I am. Here's exactly how I've felt. Here's what I've worked through, and, on both sides of the fence, so that nobody has to be in shame around that anymore between Dana and Dan. The repression, because I just don't want people thinking it's about porn addiction, because that was Dan's thing. And not only do we not focus on which kind of addiction really it is, but we don't really focus on the behavior. The repression piece that he talked about, see, because that's a thing that's related to sex. We think of repression as emotional repression or sexual repression. That's what someone who's in a really stringent abstinence-based sex addiction program sometimes deals with, is this pressure to repress even some of the very healthy desires are not problematic sexual.
Happens with food addiction too.
Yeah, right. But it's not just like, so that's very, very, very damaging, I think, to repress a biological urge. There are definitely better ways to do that than to do something which represses the entire urge. I think it's very damaging. But then here's something that's a bit controversial to say, is the repression happens similarly with drugs and alcohol, because it's a problem with an abstinence approach that doesn't deal with the pain. So if you're refraining from your drug of choice, whether it's porn or heroin, if the pain isn't being dealt with, then it's sending a message to repress the very thing that you were using to deal with the pain.
Right.
See, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I feel like we need to start talking about harm reduction, not in the sense of just, can someone get on buprenorphine or methadone, but can we understand that until people are healed, that they need something. And so if you're going to take away their primary thing, and then you're going to send them a message that virtually every way in which they were acting out to cope with that is now off limits, there's a certain repression that comes from that. It sends a signal that, it sends a very strong signal to you in terms about what so we have to be very careful about what we're saying to people. You can't offer abstinence on the one hand and not deal with their pain fully on the other hand. If you do, you do them a disservice, I think.
Can I make a comment too on that?
Yeah.
So, I've been in Al-Anon for about 10 years now. So it's like I've seen this a lot because I worked with people and I'm been in Al-Anon, but it's a lot of people when they're in their pain and they're in that, if they're in a role of like the Al-Anon, of the friend or family of the alcoholic or of the addict, there's an element of it where the person's suffering, and just because of the nature of it, that they want, it's unconscious, but they want the other person to suffer with them. That the pain wants other people to, and and that's the painful stuff. I heard a guy say one time, in there, I'm dying because of the way that I'm treating other people, and I can't stop treating them that way.
This is a piece that Dan really brought as he started to work here at the Kiloby Center and trying to illuminate all these elements within the external pressure that are going on. And one of them is these two things of resent and submit. So basically, if you're being pressured to change because of behavior anyway, either you don't have that many choices really. You have to submit the demand externally, in which case you better hope that there's a full surrender to that it becomes your desire. It actually fully is your desire, because if it's not, then there sets up this resent along with it. I now resent you. I'm submitting to your demand for me to change and get better. I feel the pressure. I'm submitting to that, but I now resent you. And there's a lot of really negative with the resentment. And so there's a constant push-pull about submitting and resenting. And then that person cannot really make a clear decision about what they want in their life, man, because they're so busy submitting and resenting to the external pressure. So you have to relieve all that so they can get a clarity from presence, from awareness, like where they peel back the ego stuff that they downloaded. And then they can finally decide what they want. So one question we ask clients is just, what is it that you want? If you want to use drugs, then that's what you'll do. Okay. If you want to go look at these issues, that's what you'll do. But you have to get clear of what you want, and how can you when you've downloaded so much stuff from the other side that you're so busy resenting and submitting. One problem with that sort of strict abstinence approach, especially with food or sex, but you could argue for drugs and alcohol, is that what it's doing, it's like, if someone stops using their drug of choice or activity, very rarely does someone strip away all the stuff that's connected to that thing. So in other words, very rarely does someone stop using alcohol and really truly work on the traumas that are connected to it, and the beliefs and the external pressure and the shame. So and the problem with that strict absence approach is that sometimes these drivers, sometimes these beliefs and these triggers only come up when you use. Because if you don't use, they lie dormant in your unconscious. And they're drivers, and they're ready to come back out whenever you use, if you don't have a skillful way of dealing with it. But sometimes you have to use. And so, of course, with food and sex, if the person is open, we do, like Dan said, is encourage them to act out for the purpose of trying to figure out what's attached to this that we need to work with. So it's another thing I want to just reiterate, because it applies to drugs and alcohol. Does that mean that we here at the Kiloby Center go encourage people to use heroin? No, we don't do that. But we know that it's going to happen anyway, because people relapse. And when it does, it's non-shaming, hopefully non-judgmental, and then going back to see what's connected to it. See, because that's what we're interested in. So we use those opportunities instead of saying, it's awful that you used heroin again. We say, oh, we see that you used heroin again to deal with something. What can we go and see what that is? And it's that loving and simple and gentle. I feel like I have to say this because we're talking about the momentum of conditioning. All this conditioning, intergenerational conditioning, all of the conditioning that we picked up and we're carrying around, the drivers, the trauma, the shame, the deficiency stories, the external pressure. We can't use, as Einstein says, you can't use the same mind really to fix that, because that mind created that. So you have to be careful if you're going to use that same mind to try to get out of that loop. This is what I like about inquiry, because it allows you to step back from the loop and look at it from awareness and untangle it. something that's so unique about this is that it takes a lot of openness to really look at conditioning. It takes sort of like you have to think outside the box in terms of what recovery is, because sometimes you have to suffer a little pain to find an opening that opens up a new thing. Sometimes a relapse has to happen, or you have to go to where Dan went, where you go to everything you can possibly do to fix the thing and it doesn't work. And then you finally realize, I can't fix it with the same mind. You see? Yeah. So something has to click. So if somebody's hearing that and saying, yeah, I've been trying to fix this with the same mind, just remember that's the mind that downloaded and internalized all of the pressure and all of the judgment and the shame. That's the same mind that did that you're trying to now fix your addiction with. Just another thing, it's just a lot of families like this. That's why I was crying earlier for those who saw that. It's like, there's just so many families like this. Virtually every family that sends somebody that the Kiloby Center has some version of this going on. It's not about Dan and Dana at all. It's about all of us.
This is really universal. This is how our systems work, our protective mechanisms work, and how it is if we can't be present with what's going on. Yeah, so you're always in reaction and you can't really get clear on what you want. If there was one thing that you would tell someone who's newly trying to heal from addiction, or one thing, and this has been a little bit of a different topic, but what would your thing be that you would want someone to know? Do you want to start, Dana?
I would say to look at your own trauma, it's like what Scott and Dan were saying, don't focus so much on the addiction, on the symptoms that are showing up, but what's underneath that, what's driving the bus, what's really pushing that forward, to look at that, to look at your own life and look at that, to somehow turn from looking out there to looking in here. That's really, I think, what it's about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Dan, what would you say?
Yeah, probably something similar. I mean, I'd probably say this doesn't have a lot to do with drugs or drinking or whatever. This, and what she just said also, that's the big piece is is that if the problem is internal and the solution's internal, it's not, nothing out here has to change,
Yeah.
Right. The last word goes to you, Scott.
They covered the things that I would say, but another one I would say is that it has nothing to do with morality. It has absolutely nothing to do with that. I can't get clear enough, can't say enough, because I still see people even in our space who say that, but then act as if it is a moral issue. Like you would never treat often someone who's suffering from cancer in the way that someone who's suffering from addiction gets treated. In terms of like, police your bootstraps, what's wrong with you? Why can't get your act together? You would never say that to someone in remission and cancer. So if we're going to treat it like a disease, let's treat it like a disease. Even though I have issues with treating it like a disease, if we're going to talk that talk, let's treat the patients of that disease with the kind of dignity they respect, that they deserve. That it's not a morality. And there's more that I could say, but the other thing I want to say is that, frankly, it's not even choosing any of it. And I don't mean that in a way to alarm people or to get them to disagree or anything, but when's the last time you had a really strong emotional state or a craving or an upset, and did you choose the state? Did you literally choose the state? If you didn't, then this is what's going on. Everybody's not choosing these states of being and these behaviors and this conditioning, and other people are reacting as if they're choosing it and then getting mad at them for it. What we need to see is that it's all conditioning, it's arising, we're not choosing it, but we can inquire into it and unravel. It's like an operating system. It has a little tweaks in it. You just unravel those tweaks and you get the clarity out of it. So I'm just saying, there's no free will in any of it, and it's not a moral issue. Now can we focus on what's important?
Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful to have this discussion and to have the perspective from Dan and Dana, as well as the theory and the container for understanding how this works. Yeah. Thank you.
Go to kilobicenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online for 48 hours after they air, or you could purchase an all-access pass. kilobicenter.com.